Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord our God, our wisdom, our salvation. Amen. So what does it take for you to believe a promise someone has made? What does it take? Well, I suppose one of the things that is necessary to believe someone will keep a promise is that the promise probably needs to be reasonable. I mean, I could promise someone if they'll do something, I'll give them $1 million. It's very doubtful I can keep that promise. So I suppose a promise has to be reasonable. But I also think that in order to believe that someone can keep a promise is that the person making the promise has to be believable. They in themselves have to be credible, don't they? They have to be a person who is known to keep their commitments, to be the kind of people, as Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Many years ago, long before Carol and I came to Ashland, we lived in another place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. There was a fella who always volunteered to do all kinds of things. Something new happened, whether it was in church or school or the community, and he was always the first to say, oh, I'll do that. He was one of those persons who got very excited about something at the beginning, but then, the excitement wore off after a little bit, and he became known. He had a reputation for not following through with his promises. And so you can imagine after a while, when he would volunteer for something, people would roll their eyes. They just ignore him, or they thank him and then decline the offer. He was a nice guy. He had good intentions, to be sure, at least at the beginning. But he became known as somebody who just didn't follow through on what he said that he was going to do. He was a person who was known not to be able to keep his promises. So I suppose the ability to believe in promises depends on what we believe about the promiser. In our story this morning from Genesis, Abraham and Sarah are asked to do something that the people of God often in Scripture are asked to do: believe an impossible promise. An impossible promise. It's impossible because what they're asked to believe, no human being could possibly keep. But the difference is, the promiser is always God. So Abraham and Sarah are asked to believe an impossible promise being made by the only one who can keep impossible promises. Abraham is hanging out in the shade, trying to stay cool under the oak trees, and he's sitting to the entrance of his tent, and he looks up and there are 3 men standing near him. And Abraham does what any good, upright person in the ancient Near East would do, would be to offer hospitality. This is what you do. He sees them coming and he runs to them and he offers hospitality. He bows before them. This is just a way to respect. We don't know who these 3 men are. We're not told. They seem to have some special knowledge. Some have said maybe they're angels. That's possible. We're not told. We're just told they're men, but it could be. Some have seen a foreshadowing of the doctrine of the Trinity here with the 3 men, and probably not what the story meant in its context. Our great doctrines of the faith are the great trees that grow from the seeds of Scripture, but Sometimes we want to watch about reading those great trees back into the text, but here are three men. And Abraham does what he would have done with any of us had we shown up in his presence. So he brings them water, he washes their feet. Come rest under the trees. Let me bring you some bread. And so they say, do as you have said. And so they sit down. And so Abraham hastens into the tent. And he says, make quickly. Now my translation here says 3 measures of choice flour. Now remember, he says to the strangers, the 3 men, he says, let me get you a little bread. This is about 30 quarts of flour, folks. So he is not only making bread for them, but probably making bread for them to go. And it's fresh bread. Surely there's bread always laying around you could give to guests. They would have not thought anything different from that. But no. We're going to make fresh bread. And he goes to the herd and he takes a calf to prepare it. Now this is really hospitable, because meat in the ancient Near Eastern diet was a luxury. It was not something you ate every day. It was saved for a special occasion. And by the way, we all know this is going to take a while to prepare, right? This is somewhat maybe hard for us to understand in our fast-paced world. But in the world of that day, they would have had the time. They would have actually taken time to have some leisure, to sit and wait for this food to be prepared. He takes curds and milk, yogurt and milk, if you will, and prepares it. Abraham is hospitable, but he is generously hospitable to people he doesn't even know. And they sat down and they ate, and he, the head of his household, nevertheless decides to take on the role of the servant and stands there ready to serve them while they eat. And then they ask him a strange question: where is your wife? In this custom, in this world, that's not really a question you would ask. The men usually ate together and did all the stuff together. Asking where the women were was not really a question in that culture. But they ask, oh, she's in the tent. And Sarah's listening to the conversation. And there's a promise that is made. By the way, the promise has already been made earlier, way back in Genesis 12, years before. Sometimes it's hard when you read these texts in Genesis or anywhere else in the Bible, because the stories are so abbreviated and edited down. It almost seems like all this happens within the space of maybe a few months or years, at the most a few years. But there's a lot of years between Genesis 12 and Genesis 18. Back in Genesis 12, God says to Abraham, I'm going to, in his old age, he and Sarah, who have no children, said, I'm going to make a great nation of you. In fact, your descendants are going to be more numerous than the grains of sand on the seashore, which obviously means they're asked way back in Genesis 12 to believe an impossible promise. Way back there, I'm going to give you a son. And yet here we are years later, and it has yet to happen. Ishmael has been born by Abraham and Hagar, the maid servant. We're going to talk about Hagar next week. But now Abraham is told he's going to have an heir, but it's going to be with his wife, Sarah. And Sarah, we're told, laughs to herself. This is not the laughter of joy. It's the laughter of cynicism. Right, yeah. Yeah. And I've got some choice swampland in Florida to sell you. Right? And yet somehow they know Sarah has laughed, but she denies it. Interesting. You know, I wonder sometimes, when I read the stories of these great men and women of the faith throughout the Bible, that they're just like us. In that they believe, but at times they doubt. But in the midst of their doubt, they also believe. Right? We're kind of a mixed bag, aren't we? And I think Sarah laughs because she doubts, but then she backtracks and she lies. She doesn't tell the truth, but she says, no, I didn't laugh because maybe down deep, yeah, she believes it's possible. Maybe she does believe. Well, you know, actually, the Lord can do what the Lord wants to do. And so she's afraid her laughter may keep the promise from coming true. So maybe here, this denial of laughter is in some way a spark of belief, a spark of faith. That God will indeed do what God promises. And then Isaac is born. And Isaac in Hebrew means laughter. And so Sarah's cynical laugh turns to the laughter of joy. How wonderful. I still remember when our first daughter was born, our first child, and I was there for the delivery, and the midwife said to us, "You're about to have a baby." I knew that for 9 months. But at that moment, it just tickled me, and I laughed. Laughter of joy. So Sarah's laughter turns to joy with Isaac. God has fulfilled God's promises. Friends, the people of God have been asked constantly throughout the generations to continue to believe in promises that everyone else thinks is impossible, but we continue to believe in them because we know who has made the promise. As I said last week in the sermon, that Christians are people of patience and hope, and that Christians, of all people, Christians should be the most patient people in the world and the most hopeful people in the world, because for 2,000 years we have patiently waited and believed in the hope that in God's good time, Jesus is going to return and make everything all right. And so are we prepared to believe in the promises of God? Are we prepared to believe that God is going to do for us and do through us for the world what you or I cannot even imagine? One of my favorite verses of Scripture comes from Paul to the Corinthians, his second letter, where Paul says, in quoting Scripture, "No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no human heart has believed what God has prepared for those who love Him." And we're going to come to the Lord's table here shortly. Believing that in that Last Supper, that first Lord's Supper, that Last Supper 2,000 years ago with Jesus' first disciples, that they had to come to believe through the resurrection that this death on the cross, that they were so sure at that time meant nothing but defeat, actually was a victory. And how impossible that is for us, 2,000 years, to put the cross up here. Where is it? Right here. Right behind me. To put the cross up there. An instrument of capital punishment. An instrument that is only used for criminals. And after 2,000 years, we take that symbol and impossibly make it a symbol of victory. Make it a symbol of hope. Are we prepared to believe the impossible? Are we prepared to believe the impossible promises that are made because we know the one who makes them? And we know the one who makes them is faithful, and God will always keep God's promises, come what may. Let us pray. Gracious God, how grateful we are for the promises. how grateful we are for your trust in us, that you trust in us enough to make these promises in the hope that we will believe. Sometimes it's hard to wait for you to fulfill your promises, like Abraham and Sarah. We want to believe the promises, but sometimes our schedule just isn't yours. And perhaps sometimes we wish you would hurry up. But help us also to have the patience to wait upon the promises, wait upon you, knowing that you will fulfill all things in your good time. Help us to trust in your divine time for us. And may we move forth, hoping and believing, what so many others have refused to believe, some who have perhaps given up on. Help us to keep the faith, and in keeping the faith, share it with those around us. In Jesus' name, amen. Friends, as we now enter into our joys, concerns, and prayers, let us continue to remember to